Okay, so how can you tell a good neighborhood from a bad neighborhood? Okay, and good and bad has a different definition for everyone. I know when I moved from Australia to the US, my view of a bad neighborhood was so different than what people's views of a bad neighborhood in the US. In Australia, many of the bad neighborhoods just didn't look that nice. Maybe they didn't have good transport access, public transport. Maybe they just weren't that nice, right? But generally speaking, they were okay, but they just weren't as nice as other neighborhoods. When I went to the US, I found out that a bad neighborhood was actually a really bad neighborhood. And, when I was in Columbus, there's certain places that had just weird names like Machine Gun Alley, right? It's just a lot of people get shot in those places. You have all sorts of problems. And so, your definition of bad can be different depending on where you're coming from. But, even in so-called bad neighborhoods, you can have good pockets in those neighborhoods. There were areas where we knew, okay, these streets we don't buy in. But we can buy the next street over, literally the next street over was fine. Sometimes it was on different ends of a street. So, this part of the street was no good. But if you went to this part of the street, it was actually okay. And it was okay for like years. It was no problem, And there's just various reasons for that. Sometimes even on the same street, like there was one street where we bought a house for a client and there were, I think, maybe 30 houses on the street. And for whatever reason, the first 5 houses on that street had been burnt out and boarded up. And those houses looked really bad. They were blighted. They'd been like that for years. But then moving on, the 6th, 7th, 8th, 10th house looked fine. And then by the time you got to the 11th, 12th house, they actually looked okay. And so we bought a house for a client. It was like the 13th house or something like that. One of the last ones on the street. And it was actually fine. And we never had any major problems with it. The tenants were good and it looked really, really nice. And so when you're buying a property, remember, property is always local. It's not about just labeling a neighborhood with a general label. It's about where is it in that neighborhood. And sometimes it can literally be within a street or the side of the street or the next street can be good and one can be bad. And that's why you want to work with someone that actually knows what they're talking about. Or if they don't, at least go and inform yourself because this is your hard-earned money. And I've seen people make this mistake where they're buying properties in an area that they don't know, especially out of state or in another country, and things can look good on the surface, but they're not necessarily going to be good for you in practice. And I've seen a lot of people that get wooed by, amazing returns on paper that then go on and buy that property and find that it's not what they thought that it would be. And most of the time that just comes from a lack of ignorance or not a lack of ignorance, comes from ignorance or a lack of knowledge about that area. So just remember that real estate is very, very local. And when I walk down a street now, I can tell what's a good neighborhood or a bad neighborhood, oftentimes just by what I see. Like if you walk down a street and you see a bunch of vehicles that are parked up on bricks, that's a bad sign. If you see a bunch of indoor furniture outside, that's a bad sign. Now, I'm not saying you can't buy there, but you just have to understand the market, okay? And most of the time, investors, right? Investors are not living in those suburbs. Investors are living in nicer suburbs, they're more high income and they're looking to get into investing and they're looking at some of these cheaper suburbs because that's where they can afford or they think that they can make money. But they're not used to that kind of environment. And so it's hard for them to tell whether or not that's going to be a good area to invest in. So here's a couple of things to look for if you're new to investing in lower income suburbs. Number one is look at the grass. Okay, it's going to sound funny, but look at the grass. If the grass is overgrown, and I'm not talking about one house, but I'm talking about in general. If the grass is overgrown, if the trees are not maintained, if there's just bad landscaping everywhere. Now, I'm not talking about it has to be pretty, but it just has to be clean. That's a good sign. Number one. Number two, look for the vehicles. Are there vehicles parked in the street that are up on bricks and things like that? I'm not talking about one person that's repairing a car. That's different. But if there's a bunch of derelict cars, like you can see, they have flat tires, they look old and rusted and so on, that's a problem. Look at the types of cars, right? Oftentimes, the types of cars give you a good sense of the income in that neighborhood. And I'm not saying you're going to find Porsches and Ferraris, right? What I'm saying, though, is are they good, decent cars? And more importantly, are they well maintained? Are they clean? Do they look like people care about them? Because that's going to have a massive impact on how they care for their houses and how they're able to look after that neighborhood. And then the last one, really, it's a great giveaway, honestly, is furniture. You will see people bring out indoor furniture outside. There's a difference between having a patio set, and all that sort of stuff. That's very different. But, they'll bring like just a normal cloth couch and dump it on the front lawn and people will sit on that couch, and that's not a good sign, because it's not meant for that. And it just means that people just hang out. And you'll see this, like if you drive through a neighborhood, always drive through during the day and then during the night. Because there are some neighborhoods that look awesome during the day because everyone's at work or doing whatever. And then at nighttime, that's when all the crazies come out and you realize that it's not the sort of neighborhood where you want to own a property. But drive during the day and honestly see how many people are just hanging out. Sitting outside. You'll see this in many of these neighborhoods. People just sitting outside, sitting on a chair or on a couch, or just milling around that neighborhood. What that tells you is these people are not employed, generally speaking, And so if you see a lot of that, that could be a neighborhood that's going to cause you some problems, because people that are not employed, they get bored, they do silly things, they're looking for something to do. And that's where you see a lot more crime and things like that. Again, it's not true of everyone in every case, but just from experience of doing this so many times, it's just a sign that you have to look out for. So if you add all these things together, you want to look for, is the grass cut? You want to look for, are the cars well maintained? There's not a lot of derelict vehicles. You want to look for, not a lot of furniture out in the yard or on the front porch or whatever. And then you want to make sure there's not a bunch of people just milling around aimlessly during the day. These are all signs of the type of neighborhood that you're buying into, And nothing's ever a guarantee, and you can buy in a good neighborhood and have problems, but I'm just saying, having done this for a long time, these are just some of the markers that I look for as I'm looking at properties in a neighborhood to get a sense of what kind of tenants might be living there. So I hope this has helped you. See you next time.